Why is there such a huge gap between what we think parenting will be and what it actually is? What are the jobs of mums and dads now?
A father could do this care just as well as a mother, but that's not the part of his research that really got picked up.
What's a dad now he's no longer just a provider? What's a mum now that she often is? Why, when we think having children will bring us closer together, does it so often push us apart?
What I wanted was for him to kind of get wound up and crazy with me.
What am I supposed to teach or model for my children when I have no idea what the world is going to look like in 5 years' time? Why did my parents have so much conviction about these things and I have absolutely none?
There isn't anyone on Instagram or anyone writing a book who can tell you how to do that right. I mean, that's the really complicated work of parenting.
Well, I don't know, but there are some really intelligent people all around the world who've been thinking about this stuff, and they are going to talk to me, and we might not answer all those questions every week, but if we listen to their ideas, maybe we can get some wisdom and some insight and maybe most importantly some perspective and find out what it takes to be a happier parent. The ideals around parenting change all the time. But actually, our preoccupation with attachment theory means that they have never been higher than they are right now, particularly when it comes to mums. This episode, I am going to talk to Nancy Reddy, the author of The Good Mother Myth, a book where she unpicks a lot of the dubious science behind attachment theory. We also discuss why it is at this very moment in time that attachment theory has gained so much popularity. We talk about how these ideals for mothers are actually really, really damaging for dads, and also how if we decide we're going to follow experts, we lose out on one of the most beautiful parts of being a parent, getting to know your own child. I hope you enjoy this conversation. The book is called The Good Mother Myth. When I started to read it, obviously these ideals that we have around motherhood that you talk about, you can really feel them. But I just wonder if you could summarize for us what some of them are.
Sure. I mean, the biggest thing for me is the idea that a good mother is capable of doing like all the caregiving on her own. That, you start out as a kind of ordinary woman, and then through pregnancy and birth, which is of course only one way to actually become a mother, but like through pregnancy and birth, you're transformed into a mother who knows what to do, who's capable of doing all the caregiving, who is really the best person to do that caregiving, and who just loves her baby so much that she doesn't mind. And so that's a pretty, I don't know, kind of impossible tangle of expectations, but it's one that I think I certainly carried without really realizing all of those ideas were in there. And I've talked to a lot of other women who said, I really identified as a feminist. I was this person. And I was surprised by how those kinds of ideas came up for me in motherhood.
That idea that you're going to love your child so much you don't mind. That's really interesting. I think there's a bit of the book where you say something like, the love doesn't make the labor easier. And you're not talking just about the labor, I don't think. You're talking about the labor of parenting, right? Where do these ideas come from?
I think it's in part these ideas, which sound really regressive when you spell them all out. There's obviously not really any room for a father in that mythology, except as maybe an occasional helper. I think these ideas are really persistent because they're kind of everywhere. I think for a lot of women, those are ideas that we absorb, through our own families, through our culture, whether we mean to or not. I mean, I look specifically in the book at the kind of historical and scientific origin of those ideas, specifically in the post-war period, and the research that was being done, especially by psychologists and psychoanalysts, around this question of what do children and babies need in order to become happy adults. And the post-war period is really a moment when a lot of these cultural ideas end up being backed up by science. And most of the science actually turns out to be a little dubious, but it stuck with us anyway.
Lucy Jones, who's been on this show, draws this distinction between attachment parenting, which is a philosophy, and attachment theory, which is to some degree backed by science. And your book argues very convincingly that the science itself is bad. What's wrong with the science behind attachment theory?
I mean, the short version is that, at least in its origins, which is really what I'm looking at. So we're talking about 1940s, 1950s in the UK and in the US. The central problem is that these are scientists who had already determined what they wanted to find, and then they went out and found it. If you look at John Bowlby, for example, who is a British psychoanalyst, and he worked in London, and he worked with children who, had been very traumatized by the war. And he was charged by the WHO with traveling around Europe to try to understand the mental health of homeless children. And he was very clear in his letters from the time that he already knew, before he went on that trip, what he believed. He says something like, I don't want to talk to too many people who won't know what they're talking about. He's not going out with an actual scientist's curiosity about what's happening. And he's very clear as well that when he finds things that don't align with what he'd already believed, he just kind of puts his pen down. Like, he gets to Sweden and they're doing all of this kind of stuff where they're like giving families homes and all the stuff that we think of, the kind of Scandinavian cliches, and he just does not include that in his report, because he had already decided that mothers were the problem, and that really what was wrong with these children was that they had not been loved enough by their mother, which is a pretty shocking finding when you consider what was happening in that time period.
Yeah, because there's much more of an absence of men, right? The men that aren't around. There's a reason men aren't around, quite a good one at that point. But yeah, it feels like a big jump to get to that conclusion.
At the very beginning of his research, he says something like, a mother's love is like vitamins. And he really believed that a mother's care, it was essential for both the mental health of the child, their kind of emotional stability, but also really their physical health. This is the time period when vitamins have just been discovered, and he really thinks there's a biological component to it. And I should say, obviously, I think that mothers are important. I am one. I think that love and care in a child's early years is important. But I think if we had this really myopic look only at moms, we miss all of the other people who can love kids and help them. And I think that's also just too much pressure for one woman to carry.
So what is the initial experiments done? Because I think the things we associate with attachment theory are the experiment, the strange situation experiment, where you have a child and it's monitored how it behaves when it has its mum to go back to, and then I think there's a stranger enters the room, and then that's kind of noted as well. Actually, that's one of Bowlby's students, Mary Ainsworth, who does that work. So what's Bowlby's science? Where does he get his attachment theory from?
I mean, that's a great question, actually. Bowlby, he did this study in 1944 where it's 44 juvenile thieves, and he does this whole study of, these juvenile delinquents that he's working with. And after that, he never really did. I mean, he was a clinician. He worked at the Tavistock Clinic in London, but he never really did his own research after that. What he did was he was really good at gathering other people's research that bolstered or seemed to bolster this argument that he was making about, that what a baby needs most is a kind of constant, uninterrupted connection to a primary caregiver. So he really, even before Ainsworth, he became very enamored of the research of Harry Harlow, who was a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin, who did these kind of iconic studies with baby monkeys that seemed to prove that that contact comfort was really important, which is true. I mean, babies do need to be held. They need to be cuddled. It's not enough to just feed your baby. He also really loved Konrad Lorenz, who is an Austrian ethologist. He studied animal behavior. Lorenz studied imprinting, the way that like a baby duck is born and will kind of attach to whatever figure it sees first. Bowlby found that very compelling as a way of thinking about babies and caregivers. And then as he worked with Ainsworth, he was able to draw in her research.
I mean, the thing that really leaps out there, looking at the sort of ducks will attach to the thing they see first, and then Harlow with I looked up these cloth monkeys, and they are steel cylinders with kind of like bicycle reflectors for eyes, and it like what you're kind of saying there is babies need something to attach to, and it could be anything. but then there's this massive jump to, and it has to be the mum. But really, you could do the same experiment and say, I'm calling this thing Nancy. Now every
Yeah.
baby needs a Nancy. Like it's a huge, so there's this massive blind spot, right?
Yeah, no, there's a huge blind spot built right into certainly the way that Bowlby was selecting evidence from these studies to bolster his theory. One of the things that I found really fascinating when I first started doing this research is that Harry Harlow, in his first like major presentation of his monkey research, there's a line towards the very end of his talk where he says something like, because nursing is lactation is a variable of negligible importance, a father could do this care just as well as a mother, which is, of course, a finding from that study, right? If it's really just a wire cone wrapped in terry cloth, there's nothing gendered about that. A father could just as easily hold his baby in the night and feed the baby. But that's not the part of his research that really got picked up. It's like there's this really radical potential inside that research that journalists and other scientists alike just kind of left alone. And they picked up the part that said, oh, this is a mother. And Harlow called them cloth mothers.
Yeah.
Even though really they could be fathers, they could be cousins, they could be daycare providers. There's nothing particularly female about those cloth mothers, as you've seen.
And what I think I've always been quite kind about Bowlby because, like you've just said with Harlow, it is in there. He does say in the research that this could be another kind of primary figure. And you point out that he doesn't say it a lot. It's kind of just about slotted in, but he uses the word mother all the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's like an asterisk where he says mother, and then it's like, or mother figure every once in a while he'll throw in there. But I think it's pretty clear, both in his research and in his public work. I mean, he was a lifelong opponent of daycare, for example. He really used his public standing to argue against the expansion of daycare in the UK. And in his own life. I mean, he had 4 kids who he seems to have not spent a lot of time with. I think he believed as well that the mother, his wife Ursula, was the one who should be doing the caregiving.
So, do you think these are blind spots? Or do you think... so, no, you've not spoken to many men about this, but are these blind spots, or is this just misogyny?
I don't know that I think I've been thinking a lot about, I think it's patriarchy, and I think it's this is an idea about caregiving that served, certainly in the time, and I think continues to serve, broader economic imperatives. This idea of motherhood as just an ongoing selfless act of care is a really good way to draft women into doing a tremendous amount of unpaid labor and to feel like they're really terrible if they complain. But the reason that I wouldn't say it's misogyny necessarily is that it's also bad for men. Like, I think this is not, and you can speak to this from your experience better than I can, but I think these mythologies of motherhood have also really harmed men. It's meant that we don't have, I don't think, as like rich of a cultural understanding of what it means to be a good father. I think it has meant that men are not seen oftentimes. They're not assumed to be competent caregivers in the same way that women are. I think it means practically right that it's much harder to access. And I don't know if this is as true in the UK, but I know culturally, oftentimes in places where, there is paid leave available to fathers, culturally in the workplace, it can be harder to take that leave. I think our ideas about motherhood are bad for women, but they're bad for men too.
There's so much in what you just said I want to get into. The first bit, the economic bit, I struggle a bit with this probably because I don't understand economics, but we have this phase during the war where women are suddenly working, and they're doing all kinds of jobs that were previously done by men. And then we have this is the argument goes, men come back, there aren't enough jobs, there's this, let's get women back into the home. That works then suddenly we have enough jobs for women. Why is it an economic interest to keep women in the home? Why is that a good thing for the economy? Surely the economy wants everyone working.
I mean, it should, right? And if you look at, Sweden in the same time period, in the same post-war period, realized like, oh, we actually need these women in the workforce. And the women were kind of like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm gonna do all of this work at home, and you want me to go to work all day? And that was really for them, the origin of a lot of the state-supported childcare that they have. So it's like, the U.S. went one way, shut down all of those daycares, and Sweden went the other way. You're right though, right? Like, certainly it would be more economically efficient to get everyone into the workforce. And I think that's definitely true now. I think it depends on what kind of wage conditions you're thinking about. Now it's just very difficult for most families to make it on one income. And I think in the US, at least, there was this kind of blip that we want to think of as like the traditional American family. But really, it was a brief amount of time when, there was actually breadwinner wage for a lot of men, and you didn't necessarily have to have a high school education. There was a lot more union employment. Cost of living was more affordable. A lot of those families that we think of in their kind of nice suburban houses with the dad at work and the mom at home, that's underwritten by a lot of federal policy. Not to get too in the weeds, but like that's like those are VA benefits and GI benefits. The federal government is, which I think is, I don't know, runs so counter to the way, at least in the US, we want to talk about families now. But you're right. It is ultimately, and especially now, economically inefficient to have people not be in the workforce. I think we're in a place now where our ideals around family, the practical systems we've created for caregiving, and just the cost of living are all kind of running counter to each other. What do you think? That's my context in the US. And I know, the UK has a richer social safety net, because who doesn't? But I don't know. How do you see that working, where you are?
I struggle with this problem. The reason I was so drawn to your book is, why have the ideals on mothers gone up and up and up, much more difficult than they were for my mother? Mm-hmm. Like my none of us were breastfed. We were all kind of in routines, didn't sleep in the same, I got her to read some modern parenting books, and she was like, yeah,
what is this?
When do these women sleep? And I was like, they don't really. So how has that got so much worse for women at the same time as actually they're now expected to work, and you're expected to work. It's like, it's not comfortable for you to be like, I'm just a mum now either. So how has everything got doubled down on? I don't have an answer. It's one of the big things I'm trying to get to the bottom.
Yeah. And it is probably, I don't think I'm going to be able to answer that to your satisfaction right now either. But I think what you're pointing out is really true. And I think that, it's that problem exactly, I think, is part of why we have this bizarre trad wife movement, right? I think there's a certain group of young women who maybe believe, like, it is kind of a scam to say, like, you're this empowered young woman. You can work and be independent and all of these things. And to be a mom means, that you're doing all of these things. And I think that's why, at least some portion of young women are thinking, like, I'm going to opt out of that. Like,
Yeah, at
why
least
would I
I'll
do
just
that?
only have to do one of them at least.
Exactly. I'm going to go
Yeah.
back to this, what I think is traditional American way of raising children. I can never quite tell with the trad wife thing if anyone is actually doing that or if it's just something that's happening on the internet.
'Cause you've never met one. Is that what you're saying? You've never actually met one, a trad wife?
Someone who is actually really a trad wife is not on Instagram creating content about it. The women who are doing it on Instagram are actually, that is their job, which is a fascinating, Sarah Peterson and other people have written about that, the way that actually a lot of those women they're running small businesses. And in some cases they're running very large businesses actually about how they don't work, which is
fascinating.
It really is. I mean, it's this, and there's a long history of that in anti-feminist politics as well, right? Like you can think of like Phyllis Schlafly, like traveling around the country, campaigning against the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and using her time working, that's work, to tell women how great it was that they should stay home and, they don't need the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, I think in some ways...
Yeah, with a massive cause outside of her own family to pursue. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Which, I mean, if it weren't such an abhorrent cause, I would support. Yeah, but I feel like you're asking this really complicated question about why our expectations and our standards keep going up. And I think, there's a feminist scholar, Andrea O'Reilly, who talks about this. And she says, at every point in history when women have been starting to make more inroads into public life, and she points especially to the 80s and 90s with women going to college more, going to graduate school, entering the paid workforce, our expectations of mothers go up. And it's this really, and I think we're in another moment of real backlash of saying, like, yes, sure, you can have a nice job in an office downtown, but you also have to do these other things. I mean, and I think about my mom, who was an excellent mom and, a single working mother for a lot of my childhood, worked in an office downtown. And, I always understood her to be a good mom. That was an example that I was reaching for myself. And I believed that I could do better. It was like this kind of, like, she was good, but I can do better. We always had like carrot sticks before dinner because she wanted to make sure that we had vegetables. But we also had like, I don't know, Bisquick pot pie. She doesn't like to cook. So I was like, okay, that's good. It would be better if I did like homemade organic baby food, and I don't know why that. Some of that is just my psychology, but some of it I think is the kind of cultural pressures, this idea that motherhood is the most important job in the world. So you have to, do your best at every moment in every way.
I think that brings us really beautifully onto Winnicott. I was fascinated by this bit of the book because I came to Winnicott through his theory about the false self and the true self, and I didn't know about his broadcasts. Could you read where you describe the beginning of his first ever broadcast?
All right. 70 years before and across an ocean, the voice of an anonymous doctor drifted into women's kitchens each Friday morning as part of the BBC's Happy Children series. For his first talk, Getting to Know Your Baby, in December 1943, he began by assuring women that whatever their hopes and hobbies had been, even if they'd been uninterested in babies or dismayed by the restricted lives of their friends who'd become mothers, motherhood was their destiny. Every woman, he insisted, even those with wide interests, even those who'd been engrossed by business or politics or tennis, would eventually arc towards motherhood. Sooner or later, he announced, she herself becomes pregnant. And with this inevitable pregnancy, he explained, those formerly wide interests would narrow in scope until she slowly but surely comes to believe that the center of the world is in her own body.
It's all so good. even if she enjoys tennis.
That's a good Winnicott.
Yeah, I've been listening to his recording. You'll be incredibly happy that I'm not about to tell you what to do. For me, this is a massive piece of the puzzle that I'm trying to unpick, which is, and it was something that when I talked about it with my wife, it was a real revelation for her, that we as men don't get this message about fatherhood at all. It's completely lacking. We don't talk about fatherhood as men. It's not this thing that is inevitably on the horizon, and we don't come to it with these kind of this preconception that it's going to be, you use the term ultimate destination is the phrase you use. And it's at the root a lot of the resentment and misunderstanding between mothers and fathers when we start out on this journey, that we can't see this massive difference inside each other's heads. How did that play out for you and your partner, Smith?
I mean, we had a really tough transition into parenthood. We had been together for years. We had been married for several years. We really, I don't know, we were very solid, and we had a really tough time in our first couple of years as parents. And a lot of it I can see now is exactly this gap that we're talking about. Whose job is this? Who's doing this work? I had this idea that basically, I could kind of do it all with maybe some occasional help. And it turned out that that was not true. And it was a tough adjustment. I think it was very hard for me to accept that I needed help. It was very hard for me to ask for that help. And I should say, like, when I asked for help, and I write about this, when I said, I need you to take the baby on Saturdays so that I can, like, go to the gym, write, do all the things that I need to do to feel like a person. My husband did it. Absolutely, no question. But I think there's a kind of larger project of understanding really how transformative that experience is, definitely for women, but I think also for men, that fatherhood is in fact an important transformation. And I don't think we really have a good way of thinking about that or talking about that. And it was a tough stretch for a while.
Because what's implicit in this, I think you used the phrase at one point, that the magic of motherhood, this alchemical transformation that you've gone through and I haven't, and that this will, if you're any good at it, this will naturally become just your preoccupation. That's what's supposed to happen.
And that's very much what Winnicott thought. That's the way that he talked to mothers, and the way that he wrote about it was, a mother who's good enough will just know how to do all of this stuff. She'll just be transformed and absorbed.
Found myself really, you went in hard on the men of motherhood, and you were really good at it. And then I found myself, I don't know if it's because I really enjoyed his voice and his recordings, but I found myself wanting to defend Winnicott. Tell us about the one animal study you did like, the rats.
The rats? Oh, yeah, man.
Tell us about the rat study.
I should say, I am very tough on these men, some of them more than others. But my goal is not to say either, like, look at these jerks, or to just debunk what they did, because I think in each of these men, in each of these studies, there are real kernels of insight, and what they did in various ways shaped the way that we think about caregiving in ways that are still really important. And Winnicott was a tough one, because I know so many people who really admire him and whose work has been, that his work has been really important for them. So, I don't think we should throw out all of Winnicott. I just think it's important to look more carefully and add a little nuance to it. But yes, the rats. One of the things that I was really interested in this book is how we've used animal research and used animal behavior as a proxy for caregiving and mothering in particular. That was something that comparative psychologists were doing a lot of for a while. And there's this really fascinating study of rats that was done by a psychologist named Seymour Levine. And he raised baby rats in a couple of different experimental conditions. And in one of them, it was just the rats and the mother in this cage, and they're allowed to just, like, kind of cuddle up all the time. Their food is given to them. All the mother has to do is, like, care for her baby. In another cage, the scientists take the rats out every once in a while and just kind of handle them. And they find this stressful, but they put them back in the cage. In a third third experimental condition, they take the baby rats out and actually shock them. Like they give them a little bit of an electric shock and they put them back in. And it turns out that actually the worst condition to raise rats in is the one where they're totally with their mother all the time and they're never stressed and they're never removed. I mean, those rats just like turn out really kind of, socially really troubled.
Just
and this is what
rats.
They're just useless. I mean, they're rats anyway. So, and Harlow found the same thing ultimately with his monkeys, that these monkeys that he raised with these kind of perfect cloth mothers, they couldn't handle like social interaction. They couldn't handle anything. And the thing that I love about that rat study and what they found is that like a little bit of stress is actually good for baby rats. Like it's okay for them to be removed from their mother. It's okay for them to be stressed out.
That's why I'm linking that with Winnicott, because that is where I felt Winnicott landed in the end. And look, you can't just agree with everything someone says and does because you like, where they end up. But I do feel there is that overriding message behind what he says, that it's through not being able to be everything for a child and through the child experiencing those things, that's how children grow. And he's not
absolutely
asking for the perfect mother.
Yeah. No, and I think that's why that strand of Winnicott's research has resonated so much. That idea of like what a mother does is actually to strategically fail her child. And that's part of how, I mean,
that
it's very
still sounds
Freudian.
Tough, doesn't it? You've got to do it strategically. You can't
I mean,
just
and that's
fail.
really where, and that's really I think that Winnicott is not wrong, and I'm certainly not a Freudian by any stretch, but he's not wrong. I don't think that part of how children grow and become independent is by understanding themselves as like separate from their parents and experiencing someone else's failure and then knowing they can survive that. There's a really wonderful, more contemporary attachment theorist whose name is Shore says, what's important with an attachment is not actually that it be perfect. Like as a parent, you don't have to be perfectly responsive all the time. He says, what matters is repair. Like if you snap at your kid, if you are too slow to come get them in the night when they're crying, that's not actually a problem. What you can do is repair. And that I think is a really important thing to keep in mind. And it's not always the kind of central message.
We don't focus on that enough.
Yeah, I think it's changing. Like there's kind of a joke, and I think it's certainly true in my family that like I've apologized more to my kids this morning than my parents did in my entire childhood. But I think the shift that's really important to me is the idea that really it's a relationship. And if you mess up and you make a mistake, tell your kid like, oh, hey, I am sorry that I snapped at you. And then, you can move on to your day. Like if your kid is crying, you can comfort them and try to move on, and that you shouldn't beat yourself up for having done the thing in the first place.
Yeah, and I guess the other reason I like that is someone who's done loads of stuff wrong with his kids.
Haven't we
all? It suits
all?
me.
Yeah.
And because it's not too late. And this is something that I'm speaking to a lot of experts, that it's like you're a human, you're a person. Even mums are people, and they're going to get things wrong, and you can repair.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really wonderful thing to focus on. You talk about social media and the masses of conflicting advice being leveled at mums. We keep saying mums, but it is, I'm really hoping men are listening to this, but I know that it's mainly going to be mums. So this is just the reality of it. How do people like you, an author, people like me, podcaster, how do we stop ourselves from falling into the trap of just kind of adding to that noise with this, actually all that's wrong, or how do we dance around that?
Yeah, I had to think about that a lot in writing this book. And I think there's such a, I love a good debunking, right? To say like, you think this means this, but actually it's wrong. But what I really wanted to do with this book was not was not just debunk attachment theory, right? I mean, I think there are valuable things, obviously, in attachment theory. I think that like attachment is real, like we need to care for our children when they're little, but I'm interested in how we can complicate those ideas. I think that sometimes we reject one set of experts and then try to look for another one. I mean, I did this myself in the process of writing the book, where I find, you know, all of these mostly male scientists whose research is flawed in all of these different ways. And then I came across Margaret Mead, whose research I really loved, you know, and she had this idea that, you know, what a baby needs is not one perfect mother, but many warm, friendly people. And that's such a beautiful way of thinking about caregiving and family, that it's really a community project. She always raised her daughter in a household with other families, which is, I don't know, sounds like a dream to me. But she's not perfect either, you know? And I think it's not that we can say, don't be Winnicott, be Margaret Mead. What I really want, rather than any of us trying to find an expert to follow, is to kind of maybe log off and think about who we are as people and as parents and what we need and what we're good at, and think about who our kids are as people. I think that when we focus on like finding the right expert and following the right rules, it really takes us away from what's actually meaningful and joyful about parenting, which is your relationship with your kids. And there isn't anyone on Instagram or anyone writing a book who can tell you how to do that right. I mean, that's the really complicated work of parenting, but it's also the beautiful part, I think, is getting to know your own kid.
There's a quite heartbreaking sentence in it where I've been trying so hard to be a good mum that I hadn't seen our baby.
Yeah.
I hadn't seen our child.
Yeah.
Exactly as you just said, the structure of the book is you've got these three men, and then Mead comes along, and I was like, oh wow, it's like this superwoman, like kind of having all these
this is the answer,
bisexual affairs in the book. I'm like, oh, she's so cool, and then you're like, oh no, she messes it all up.
I know. I really wanted her to be like the hero of the book. And I could feel, even as I was doing that, you know, like when you write something or you have a kind of line of thought, you're like, this isn't quite right, but I wanted it so badly because she's so interesting. You know, she is this kind of like really radical person of her time. You know, she had her daughter and she always worked. She's the only one of all of the, scientists, all of the researchers in the book who had kids, whose kid has anything good to say about them after they're grown up, which is maybe a measure of things. You know, her daughter wrote this really beautiful book about her childhood and what it was like to be raised by two anthropologists. And it's clear that she felt like her mother really knew her, like they really spent time together in a meaningful way. And it wasn't because she was there every minute. I mean, Margaret Mead traveled a lot in her daughter's childhood, but they really knew each other. And that's such a beautiful, I mean, that's like a kind of thing that I at least would certainly hope my kids would feel as adults. But I mean, she is complicated and problematic in all of these other ways. And she wrote, as you know, this advice column to women where she basically told them, you know, what you should do is get married. It was like, Margaret Mead, no. So, yeah, I mean, it would be easier if there was an expert who told us, you know, these are your 3 steps. And I think that's what a lot of us are looking for.
Absolutely. We can sort of criticize, you know, the experts, we can criticize the studies, we could criticize Instagram, but essentially they're giving us what we want, and we want an answer, and we want a quick statistic, and we want someone to tell us what to do.
I know, don't we all?
And we can't have it. The other big thing that comes up in your book again and again is basically you can prove anything if you do the study badly enough. And maybe we should all be, you know, a lot more cautious about studies and being like, studies show, because all studies are not created equal.
Yeah.
And that's not a new problem. I think that's headlines are headlines, you know, no one's interested in the caveats that studies have.
I mean, in part, it's the problem of the press, which is not to say like the press is doing something wrong necessarily, but it's the kind of problem of pop psychology, right? Which is that when something moves from like scholarly and academic venues where everything has to be very nuanced and very precise, and people are really making actually usually pretty narrow claims with a lot of caveats in them, you know, nobody wants to read that in the New York Times or like hear that on the radio, right? Like what we want is a big headline that says, you know, a new study finds X,
Yeah.
you know, and people who are responsible science journalists obviously try to retain the nuance, but it's very hard to actually keep that nuance. And so I think it is really helpful anytime we see these headlines saying, oh, you know, new study claims blah, 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 or research shows that, to think like, well, like, what is that? And to try to look a little more carefully at what those findings are, because they're almost never quite as conclusive or generalizable as we might want them to be.
And modern studies, once you get used to reading them, they're not hard to read, but there are huge sections on the limitations of the study.
Exactly.
They're massive. It's just that never filters through because it would make quite a boring read, like in an article.
Yeah, there's a reason why like those things are not bestsellers, and things that make a splashier, simpler claim have much wider
flimsy study
circulation.
proves that. Yeah. Wouldn't be great. Interested in this idea that not mums and not nuclear families are really supposed to be just raising kids. And you know, you talked about Margaret Mead there, and she has these kind of amazing groups of people. How do we emulate that in today's society?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's so hard. The one part of it is that understanding that that is actually how. I'm so hesitant to give advice or tell people what to do because there's so many things. But one thing that I would say is that, I think that's exactly right. Like we are meant to do this work in community. And I think that community can look like lots of different kinds of things. But I think, you know, as I say in the book, right? Like when you look at if you look at anthropological work of families and childhood around the world, like different cultures, different communities, you know, raise their children in lots of different ways. But in basically none of them is it just, you know, one parent or two parents doing it alone. You know, if you're trying to understand what's like culturally and historically maybe more normal, it is actually the kind of community care. And I think starting with that as an assumption that like being a mom doesn't mean, you know, I'm going to be this person who can do everything on my own. You know, I had this image before my son was born of like me and him in the nursery by ourselves. Like we were going to be this kind of beautiful picture. And I don't know, maybe that was the wrong image, or maybe just an incomplete one, right? Now I think a lot about the time that I spent like sitting on my rug in my living room, you know, with a friend, with another friend with a baby, you know, all of us together. And I think I don't know, it's really beautiful to think, you know, like we are all actually going to do this together.
I think what your book actually made me think of is that maybe we rely too much on those relationships where we're going to make friends with other people with the same age, and actually they're all screwed at the same time. And what would be no one's got any spare hands there.
I think when you're in that same moment, there can be like such camaraderie. My mom talks about this because like her three best friends all had their kids at the same time. And she was like, no one else can talk to me about formula for an hour, but that's really what I need right now. But I also think it's that, you know, when no one is sleeping and everyone has a little baby, like that's a tough time to support each other. I think sometimes, especially for women, the like kids, no kids, that can be a real point of divide. And for me, those friendships that I've been able to sustain with friends who don't have kids have been life-saving, you know, both because, you know, they've been practical sources of support, but also those are people who, especially when my kids were really little, would talk to me about things other than the baby, like reminded me that I was a person and not just a mom.
Yeah. From the books I read, I think I've heard you call them on another podcast, mummy memoirs. But that's another thing which doesn't men don't relate to. We don't have this kind of loss of self because it isn't supposed to be our ultimate destination. We're still supposed to work, essentially. That's our thing. Like, that's how I become a good man.
You can be a dad outside of your 9 to 5.
Yeah. And that sucks too, like in a different way. I don't want my contribution to my family to be a workhorse. Like, there's so much more for men now. Your book ends really powerfully with the birth of your second child and a completely different experience. And I think there'll be lots of people listening to this on their first child. And I think that's an invaluable perspective. Can you just take us through what that taught you?
Sure. I mean, I think that what having a second kid taught me was that each kid is really their own person. I was so focused with my first son on trying to be a good mom and trying to have a good baby, which meant, X number of, like nap schedule, things he's eating, And it really, as we said, made it hard to actually see him. And then I had a second baby who was so different. I mean, there's still, as you know, right? Like you have more than one kid and you're like, whoa, where did these children come from? Like same genetic material, same household, and like, whoa. And he just was so different from the get-go. And it really made me realize, like, oh, what the things that were so hard, they were not my fault. They just were the way that they were. And it was really powerful. I don't know. It feels so cliche to say healing, but I really think it was, to see like, oh, this baby is a person and my other kid is a person. And what they need from me is to get to know them rather than to try to follow some other set of rules. And I don't know. I also just found like really practically that having 2 kids, part of what I write about in the book is, what I can see now as postpartum anxiety that I just didn't understand as such.
I think you said at one point, I understood it as postpartum. You weren't supposed to have kids, you asshole.
Yeah. Like, oh, I'm just like postpartum, like you're bad at this and, shouldn't have done it. And just to realize, the things that were so hard, they were not my fault. And also that they don't go on forever. I think that was a perspective that I hadn't begun to have with my first. Was, when I was up with the baby in the middle of the night or when he was waking, 10, 12 times a night, like that is really hard and that is real, but you're not going to spend the whole rest of your life like holding a crying baby in a dark nursery. I think that having more than one kid really helped me to reorient myself towards the project of building a relationship rather than following the right set of rules.
I want to ask a gendered question, quite tricky. There's a bit where you, talk about Smith, your partner, being, what are you talking about? We're doing fine. Everything's fine. I think it starts with you apologizing. Sorry, I'm not doing well at this. But I think that is really relatable for a lot of people, that you have this super anxious mum and a fairly baffled dad who's like, and there will be people reading that being like, yes, but he only gets to be chilled and enjoy it because you're doing all that worrying. What would you say to them?
It's such a good question. I mean, and I think, I'm so grateful that my husband is the way that he is. He's very like steady, matter of fact, like we're going to get through it. It's fine. And I did not appreciate that at the time because what I wanted, and I don't think this would have been helpful, but what I wanted was for him to kind of get wound up and crazy with me. I was like, I feel, this kind of like crazed level of anxiety, and I kind of wanted, I can see now, for him to mirror that back to me as a way probably of validating it. I don't think that actually would have been functional at all. And it's better that he wasn't. But I think because, we were actually, as we're looking at the same baby, having this profoundly different experience, even in that moment. He's looking at this baby who's like beautiful and healthy and doing great and thinking like, hey, this is, like, look at this kid. We love him. Things are great. And I, in part because just like, I had like hormonal neurobiological stuff happening that I was not able to see that baby in the same way. And I think there's both a need for fathers or non-birthing parents to learn more about the postpartum experience, and especially postpartum mood and anxiety disorders, because it is really a very different thing to be the person who has given birth, who is nursing. That is a physical and hormonal transformation. Even if you love that kid and you're that kid's parent and you're doing your best to do, your part of all of the work, I think you're not. I mean, I felt physically very vulnerable and exposed, I think, especially as a nursing mother, in a way that I don't think, like, as I've, my friends and sisters have had kids, holding a crying baby that is not your baby is a totally different experience. Holding a crying baby that you're not nursing is a totally different experience. So I think there's a real need for fathers to learn more about that as a way of trying to understand it. And I think that we've gotten a little better about how we talk about postpartum mood and anxiety disorders, that it's not, I mean, I had this image of postpartum depression as just like, I'm in my bed and I'm crying and I can't get up. And I was like, well, that's not what I have. Like, I'm up, so therefore it's not some other problem. It's just me failing to, do what I'm supposed to do. I mean, I think it's both doing the work, right? Like both parents being engaged, but I think it's also trying to understand the kind of subjective interior experience of that transformation.
I think that brings us back to somewhere we were at the beginning, but it's like, understanding that actually at the moment the world presents it to us, each of us, very differently. And I'm not hearing the sound you're hearing when that baby cries.
Yeah.
That sound is designed to do something to you that it's not doing to me. So, really unhelpful for me to be like, what are you on about? But also, I think probably really useful for mums to know that I can't hear that sound.
Yeah. I think, I hate to, it does feel very tricky to talk about this stuff in terms of gender, in terms of biology. One of the first things that I started researching that didn't really make it into the book was the hormonal changes that are brought about by nursing specifically, that like your body kind of keys up to respond to that baby, which makes sense evolutionarily, right? That you need the person who is keeping the baby alive to hear that cry and feel a level of urgency, but also can be a real problem because, wow, did that ramp up, like every sensor and alarm inside my body. And I think, if you're co-parenting with someone and neither of you understand the actual experience the other one is having, it's very difficult to bridge that gap.
It's been brilliant talking to you. Thank you. I've loved it. I really like your poetry as well, by the way. We haven't had a chance to talk about that.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
I thought, it's a really brave book. You kind of kill some sacred cows. And also, I think it's really amazing that you're basically continually saying, I didn't like this, without feeling the need to be like, but I do love my kids, right? Which is, I think that's a real thing to understand, that women feel like they're supposed to enjoy it, and they've got to kind of caveat that with.
I know the number of conversations I've had, and still have, like, but I love my kids. Like, well, yeah, like I wish that we would stop, feeling like we have to say that. So, because of course you do.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Nancy's book, The Good Mother Myth, is available on all the usual outlets. If you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe, and you can check us out on Patreon at Be a Happier Parent. I look forward to seeing you all next week.